Francis Levy. I'm co-director of the Philoctetes Center. Dr. Edward Desessian is the other co-director. And welcome to The Mirror and the Lamp. And I should dedicate this roundtable to M.H. Abrams, after whom the famous book, The Mirror and the Lamp, after whom this roundtable is named. And Abrams, of course, had done the classic book on romantic poetry. Actually the kind of transition between mimesis and romanticism in poetry. Now, the exhibition you see in this particular space is Self-Reflection, the True Mirror, which has been curated by Hallie Cohn, who's the head of the art department at Marymount Manhattan College, and also directs our exhibition space. And the exhibition is really about self-conception. And if you go into our annex, we have an object, or what would it really be called? It's an...
John Walters' True Mirror.
It's a true mirror. And when you, there he is, John Walters. And what it is when you, John, when you look into this mirror, you see yourself the way other people see you. That's the both literal and poetic construct that's going on there.
If I could just say a word or two.
Sure.
It's a non-reversing mirror. So any mirror you've ever seen in your life, you're always seeing yourself flipped. And what happens is that flip actually changes your image. And you might say, okay, that's expected. If you hold writing up to a mirror, it's backwards and so forth. But what it also does is changes what's in your eyes. Like your eyes are different, and I think that they're based on what's behind your eyes, so the brain and its right brain, left brain, comes through different ways on different sides. The difference is, or the point is that every person in the world has left side over here and right side over here. And that's the map that we use to read faces and read expressions. And that's what's on your face. But in the mirror, you're the only person in the world with left brain over here and right brain over here. It changes what's there. And you're in a feedback loop with yourself. So you immediately respond within microseconds to this changed image in a way that is basically inauthentic. So whatever is actually there changes very rapidly to something that's just different. And often what it does is just stops you. You tend to just stare at yourself and have a mirror face. So when you look at this mirror, it's correct. Like your right eye's over here, your left's over here. So whatever's in your face matches what's real, and that interaction is real. So you can really see if you are alive in this mirror, you're not freaking out because you look a little crooked, because that does actually show up for a lot of people. You can see yourself in your eyes, and talk about self-perception.
Thanks, John. I can only say that I was very disappointed. I'm now pleased to present Paul Harris. Paul Harris is a developmental psychologist with interests in the development of cognition, emotion, and imagination. He has taught in the University of Lancaster, the Free University of Amsterdam, and the London School of Economics. In 1980, he moved to Oxford, where he became professor of developmental psychology and fellow of St. John's College. In 1998, he was elected as a fellow of the British Academy. He currently teaches developmental psychology in the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. His latest book is The Work of the Imagination. Professor Harris will moderate this afternoon's panel, and I think there are ideas that we're going to let the other panelists sort of introduce themselves.
Thank you. Thank you. Paul, could we begin with you? Could you just say a word about yourself?
We can begin with you.
Or Margaret, if you, whichever.
Good. And we know we go clockwise.
Well, we've just sorted everything out back in the green room. So I don't know what else there is to say. My name is Margaret Browning. I am from Chicago. My interests are in psychoanalytic theory and developmental psychology and neuroscience and philosophy. I was at the University of Chicago, which is a great place to integrate the really big ideas. Right, guys? Anyway, and the person who became most important to me at the University of Chicago was a philosopher by the name of Suzanne Langer. Maybe Philosophy in a New Key sort of rings a bell with a few people. Great book. She went on and wrote brilliant things. Bhishma, I'm so sorry. Anyway, Bhishma said, oh yes, Mind, an Essay on Human Feeling, which is the last book she wrote, 3 volumes. Brilliant book, and so it's just really kind of organized my thinking. But my interest is in psychology, developmental psychology, as both completely language, completely neuroscience. It's got to be integrated. And I'm very focused on consciousness, which we just had a conversation about, which was a little bit like, oh dear. But we'll get back to it. We'll get back to it. So.
My name is Bhismadev Chakrabarti. I am a researcher at the University of Cambridge, England. And my background is in chemistry and neurobiology. And I have increasingly been working on problems which are slightly larger than the remit of the original fields. And now my PhD was on genetic and neuroimaging studies of empathy and emotions. And I continue this work now with Simon Baron-Cohen in the University of Cambridge. And yeah, that's about it.
My name is Alan Leslie. I'm now based at Rutgers University. I think of myself as a cognitive scientist, particularly interested in developmental cognitive science, but also interested in issues in philosophy of mind and those kinds of things. In my background, well, I'm Scottish, and I have Edinburgh University, Oxford University, London University in my background, and interested in development of cognition, development of thought, and particularly abstract ideas in babies and preschoolers, and also in what goes wrong in development in childhood autism. So
Paul.
I'm Paul Bloom. I'm not Scottish. I'm actually Canadian, which is considerably less exotic. That's right. Almost a colony of Scotland, really. I'm a professor of psychology at Yale, and I'm very glad to be part of this panel with this group, because I've long been interested in imagination. A lot of my work has looked at the imagination from a sort of cognitive standpoint, looking at the developing ability on the part of children to create imaginary worlds, their understanding the relationship between these worlds, their understanding what parts are imaginary and what parts are not. But more and more I've been interested in the pleasure of imagination. So why do we like imagination so much? If you ask Americans what their favorite activity is, people have done this, they'll say sex. But it turns out, according to time management studies, the amount of time...
imagination.
That's right. That's right. Well, there's actually apparently there's a lot more sex done in imagination than done in reality. The time the average American spends on sex is just about exactly the same time spent preparing tax forms for the American government. But who
did you ask?
Well, even the IRS. That's right. But our biggest pleasure by far is imaginary. Average Americans spend hours watching TV. People read novels. People daydream. People go to movies. And when our time is our own, more often than not, we retreat to the imagination. And I'm very interested in what sort of pleasure we get from that, and how that works, and how that emerges in a normally developing child.
A long time ago in Oxford, I organised a conference. Organising a conference is tough because you get people ringing up about whether they can bring their dog and their grandmother and so forth. But one of the highlights of the conference was a poster that was there from Alan, and he's going to tell you about it, because that was the first glimpse that I had that thinking about pretending was going to be important.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess sort of the reason that I would be invited to something, an occasion today, has to do with ideas that I began to develop quite a long time ago now, about the nature of pretending, and in the context of the very early emergence of pretense in human development, which is really while you're still a baby, during the second year of life, when children begin to pretend play. And many other people had studied the emergence of pretend play before me, but the idea that I had was that really pretending has to do with beginning to think about your own mind in a certain way. And that made the prediction that when when children begin to pretend all by themselves, they'll also be able to recognize when other people are pretending. And oddly enough, everybody, as far as I could make out, everybody that studied the development of pretend play had just sort of missed that. They hadn't really sort of noticed that children understand when other people pretend and join in and share their games. So anyway, my analysis that I started to work on said that in a very deep sense, pretending is actually something social. It's really part of our ability to be part of the social world and to begin to pay attention to the thoughts and feelings of other people, including ourselves, because we can think about ourselves. And that led to certain ideas about what might underlie the social impairment that you find in childhood autism, and that's the distinctive feature of autism. And so these ideas were developed with Simon Byrne-Cohen, and who was a young graduate student at the time, and Uta Frith, who was a great expert on autism. So it's really this link with imagination and pretending. I was saying back there earlier on that pretending is a very special form of imagination. Not just because it develops very early in life, but also because of its deliberate nature, its voluntary nature. One decides to pretend, and one retains control over one's own pretense, but also because you can recognize pretending in others. And it sort of comes along with pretending that whenever you pretend, you're aware that you're pretending. So you have this awareness of your own pretending and your awareness of other people. And so we were talking about consciousness back there too. But,
well, so you'll have to explain right now. Can we just speak up here?
Go ahead.
Is that okay? How you're going to make a distinction between being aware and being conscious? Because Alan is like, I don't know about consciousness, but you know, deliberate intention to pretend and you're aware of it, it sounds pretty conscious to me.
Well, I mean, so just to avoid misunderstanding, I don't deny the existence of consciousness. Some people do. I don't. It seems to me to be. It seems to me to be a reality. It's just that I haven't the foggiest idea how to go about actually understanding it. So I distinguish between, as a number of others do, between awareness and consciousness. And consciousness really has to do with all the things that nobody can understand at this time. Occasionally you might meet somebody who tells you that they understand consciousness. You talk to them for 5 minutes and you pretty well figure out that they don't really understand what consciousness is. But awareness really has to do with those things that at least we have some chance of understanding at this point in history.
I would like to just state my position because it's completely related to imagination. I mean, for me, and just to put it out there, I think, and this is completely Suzanne Langer, really, I think that consciousness is a state of feeling, and it's a neurological state. We just had this conversation before about, well, is qualia something beyond the brain? No. But I'm certainly not looking for qualia beyond the brain. So it's in the brain, but it's a state of the brain which produces, an ongoing subjectivity, its experience, and Langer's perspective is to say it is all a state of feeling. And we feel with our sensory receptors, which gives us vision and hearing and so forth. You know, the objective world is what we feel, impact of the world. We feel things within ourselves. We are always, as long as we're up and moving around, we are in a state of feeling. Our state of feeling guides what we do. There are a million other things guiding what we do, but the mindedness based on a state of feeling is extremely important. That simply by itself is consciousness. And then imagination comes along as, guess what? The human species, human species takes this ongoing feeling state and starts projecting it into language, ideas. I thought, talking recently to somebody, I remembered that scene in the Helen Keller autobiography where, the water's on her hand and Helen's there as a child and Annie, the teacher's there, and the water, 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 and Annie spelling it out like, hello, there's the water. And then suddenly it was like, oh, the idea That's imagination. And Paul, Paul Harris, I think your work, the book Imagination and the Work of the Imagination, talking about imagination is a stepping back from the actual. I mean, you pull out of ongoing actual, you're just responding to the world, you take a step back, it's kind of an an interruption of things, and that is imagination. Now what you said, Alan, that would be imagination in the very broadest sense of the word. We're all sitting here living in our imagined symbolic culture. Obviously we're physical creatures, and here we are sitting, etc., but we have all these thoughts in our heads. So,
can I think it's going to help us a little bit if we step back again to those small children who are pretending and think a bit about autism, because that was a really important theoretical move, I think, in developmental psychology, to start making contrast between the everyday pretending and imagining shown by normally developing children and the limitations that we see in children with autism. So I'm going to ask Alan again if you wouldn't mind saying a bit more about that contrast.
I mean, imagination, I think, is a very, very broad notion, and in fact I really can construe it even more broadly than you have. I think imagination is just something that anything with a mind has. I think it's just essential to mentality, because to have a mind is really to do more than simply to react to the here and now.
More than that.
Is more than that, and it's always to react to the here and now in terms of possibility. And I guess that possibility is a sort of another very general idea for imagination. But of course it's sort of important for the brain, and it's important for organisms to be in touch with the here and now, and to construe it in a sort of correct way, to sort of get the very simple basics correctly. There's a table in front of me here. I'm sitting in a room as opposed to out in the middle of 3rd Avenue or something where I might be in danger. So these kind of simple things that the brain ought to be designed from the ground up to get right. And so it's sort of striking when you see in still just very, very young kids, babies really, when you see this emergence of this other kind of cognition that kind of breaks the chains of thinking about the here and now, and makes explicit, but without language, because these babies are too young to really have much in the way of language, or to be using language to encode their thoughts. So I see this as a property of thought, or in the first place, rather than a property of language, and then later language piggybacks on this property of thought, and language can then express these properties of thought in basically for the purposes of communicating thoughts from one person to another. But the young baby starts to break the chains of the here and now, and starts to think about in a deliberate fashion, deliberately begins to think about how things might be, and not simply how things actually are. So when faced with a banana, the child can think of the possibility, well, this banana, I can pretend that it's a telephone. Here's an empty cup, yes, but I can pretend to fill it, and I can pretend that it's full, and now that I'm pretending it's full, I can pretend to empty it again, and now I can pretend that this empty cup is empty. So this seems to me to be a new and very powerful form of thought that develops very, very early in human beings. As far as I know, this kind of thought doesn't develop in any other kind of species. I'm just not, have an open mind on that question, but so far as I can see, the evidence is that we're the only species that actually pretends in this full-blooded sense. And then, as Paul mentioned, there are various links with this capacity and with the problems that children in autism have. They don't seem to develop this capacity for thought at this new level, thought that breaks the chains of the here and now, or at least that capacity is very much impaired. That just has serious consequences for understanding the thoughts and feelings of other people, because there's my reality and there's your reality. Well, for me to understand your reality, I need to, as it were, break the chains of my reality, because your reality might be different from mine. And so that's really how this begins to link into understanding thoughts and feelings in other people. And all of these things are exercises of imagination. And in the movie Being There, of course, the whole thing pivots on this simple-minded fellow who just means exactly what he says. My chair is close to yours, and of course everybody surrounds him just dismisses the possibility immediately that he could have meant just what he said, and so they start to imagine and read into his mind all sorts of meanings and intentions that weren't there, and that sort of encapsulates, I think, this whole deep link between imagination and understanding other minds.
I think it's fair to say, if you go back to the diagnosis of autism, which was in the early 40s by a psychiatrist called Kanner, he was very perspicuous in the sense that he identified this very puzzling syndrome. But what he did was primarily to identify a cluster of symptoms, things that went together. One of the primary ones was limited pretend play, and the other primary one was limited ability to understand and engage, make friends with other people. And I think it was particularly Alan's contribution to start thinking about the possibility that there was some deep connection between those two difficulties. Could I get Misha to say a bit now about who's doing more neuroscientific approach? Could you say where that's going, Misha?
I mean, as far as when you said the neuroscientific approach, and especially when we are talking about a difficult problem like imagination, it's very difficult. I'm not aware of many studies that has looked at the brain correlates of imagination. I might be wrong. Have there been one or
There is at least one brain imaging study of pretending.
Pretending, yeah.
Which again links it with these areas for theory about.
Exactly.
There's also one on daydreaming by Malia Mason, I think, in Science a couple years ago.
Right, but nothing really on the stuff like imaginative fluency or like Torrance creativity tests, kind of the classic tests of creativity in a behavioral testing situation, which tests imaginative generativity. But essentially, I mean, one of the ideas that's really that's kind of doing the rounds really is that there is a problem of connectivity in the autistic brain. So the back of the brain, which has mostly the sensory cortices, like vision, audition, is not communicating enough with the front of the brain. And that's possibly due to the fact that there is way too many connections in the back of the brain, and therefore the information is kind of getting spread all over the place, and not enough information is getting to the front of the brain. Now, if you take this detail of this anatomical detail with the fact that people with autism have a very literal representation, which is basically just as you see or as you hear is what they will remember, or is what would be the reigning representation in their mind. So you can start to kind of link these two together and speculate really that possibly this lack of imagination that you see in autism is due to the fact their literal representation is really highly weighted due to this over-connectivity at the local range in the sensory cortices. So that's really I would again, as I said, there's no one study that has definitively showed that yet.
I guess one example of the kind of literalness you might have in mind would be some of the drawings we see from autistic children?
Absolutely. So some, say one of the artists called Stephen Wiltshire has got a lot of fame drawing these very beautiful drawings of architecture the architecture of different buildings, and that they are in exquisite detail. So that's, of course, in the visual domain. You can also have musicians like Derek Paravicini, who is one of the most wonderful pianists around, and he picks up a very complicated piece of piano of music within seconds and plays it like with utmost expertise. So you can have this really very high degree of local detail processing, whether it's auditory or visual, and a high degree of reproducibility from what you hear or what you see. Now, that is, I think, a very big clue that links with the lack of going beyond the literal, which is imagining.
Can I say something here? First of all, I'm thinking of, it is the case, isn't it, that infants and toddlers have, what do they call it, exuberant, synaptic development. I mean, it's just like neurons everywhere, and the idea is there are millions of them, and as you develop in early childhood, you are, deciding what are the pathways, this is effective, I'm going straight this way, I don't need this, I don't need that. Yeah. And so there is an atrophy of all of those, right? So it's just sort of interesting to think that, these millions of things and they haven't quite worked out their pathways. But what I would say in terms of what you're describing with autism is, and it sort of goes to Rebecca Sachs' idea of theory of mind being you and me and this. And so what I think of is somebody who talked about early development. Infants have wonderful social skills. I mean, a 3-month-old infant, babble, face, total. And by whatever age, 5 months, 6 months, it's totally toys, totally. I'm either doing mom or I'm doing this, and I never put them together. And then, 9 months, 12 months, whatever, it becomes the whole sort of wonder of, Mom, I could take this and I could combine it with you, and then it's this and this and this and this. And so really, I mean, that's what seems to be missing and, or difficult for these autistic kids, because, Rebecca anyway talked about they seem to have good empathy with others. I mean, just on a, they're social, just as social would be okay. I can sort of read you socially, but I can't have me, you, and something else that we refer to and we work together, and then I understand that you have a point of view and I have a point of view. So pretty compartmentalized anyway, I guess.
Well, can I draw you out a bit, though, Bisha, on the neuroscientific approach? So I guess from a naive point of view, one might have thought that the newer imaging techniques were going to help us to identify the specific area of the brain which was deviant within an autistic child, so to speak. But if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that it's going to be the differences and the changes are going to be much more pervasive. They're going to be spreading throughout the entire brain. Is that?
Well, I mean, I should classify my earlier sentence, because when you look for differences between people with autism and people without autism, then very often in the neuroimaging, functional neuroimaging literature, you would ask people to do a certain kind of task. And very often these tasks tend to be the ones where we get a difference behaviorally. So if it's a theory of mind kind of task where you have to guess what a particular character in the cartoon series knows about another cartoon character, or you have to guess somebody's emotion, and so on and so forth. So most of this literature, there's a very rich literature in this field, and that has found certain very well-defined areas which are called circuits for some reason, though we do not necessarily know about exact connections or the nature of connections between these different areas. I would spare you the anatomic details, but this, I mean, this circuit really is a function of the task that people have been doing in the scanner. So if you have another kind of task, then you might find out different areas. So if you take all autism functional neuroimaging studies together across different tasks, you find a very, very heterogeneous pattern.
Okay.
And one thing that's emerging from neuroanatomy studies, really from postmortem brains, and also there's a new technique called diffusion tensor imaging, which basically measures white matter integrity in the brain. So how the white matter connecting the different, which are basically the axons of the neurons in the brain. And they find, and these functional connectivity and diffusion tensor imaging find that there are distinct differences in the autistic brain. And if that is the case, then we are not talking of a focal neural disorder here at all.
It's a connective kind of.
Yes, and it manifests itself through, you would get different areas depending on what task you put in the scanner.
Now, one of the puzzles of autism is that babies throughout the first year can develop, to all intents and purposes and to most eyes, I mean including the psychiatrists and including the parents, in a relatively normal fashion. And it's often only at around 18 months, 24 months, that one begins to see these worrying signs of the child not pointing, for example, or indeed not engaging in pretend play. Do we know enough about the development of the brain at this point to say that the divergence kicks in at around 18 months, or this is an open question?
It is actually quite, it goes quite well with the pruning, the synaptic pruning, or this cutting down of irrelevant synapses that Margaret mentioned. Is the pruning generally happens in two big stages, and one of them is some pretty close to the 18-month to around 3 to 4 years of age. So it goes off, and then other one is next to near puberty. I think just after puberty. So there are these two major bits in which pruning happens. And so again, as I say, this is very speculative. No one has actually
feel free.
Yeah.
Paul, we haven't. Do you want to?
It's just garden that it's been for it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
I didn't think of that.
Well, I'm interested in the idea, if you take imagination in a fairly narrow sense, is the capacity to sort of explicitly establish a representation of the world you know to be false, or at least known to be potentially different from the way the world actually is. And then the interesting claim is, suppose you lack that, or you're impaired in that, or even you're very good at that, what sort of things fall out from that? So you're talking about painting and art, there's issues of pretense or theory of mind. I think there's word learning in maybe a different sense than you were putting, which I think a lot of word learning relies on the ability to sort of suss out the intentions of others, to see that you are referring to that with that word. And this is, I think, one reason why children with autism can be impaired in language learning, because they don't naturally assume the mental states of others. There's also counterfactual reasoning. In order to plan what I'm going to do today, I have to say, well, if I was to do this, this would happen. If I was to do that, that would happen, and then compare.
And you consider that imaginative, yes.
Yes,
I mean,
because,
it's hypothetical.
Because if I take the 7 o'clock train versus the 8 o'clock train, there's neither train I've taken yet, and I sort of say, well, this would happen versus that would happen. And Alan here is making a strong claim, and I'm not entirely sure I buy into it, but I like it for its strength, that all of these things should fall together.
The strength of its utterance or the strength of the idea?
Both. So, for instance, you take it away from autism, there are some people who are very good at reading minds. They're very good at sussing out the intentions of others. They're above average in that. Are these same people very good at counterfactual reasoning, pretense, possibly certain forms of art and music, or will it turn out to be more modular? And I see this as very much as an open question, but a good question.
Yeah, I think that there's some in talking more broadly about imagination. I think I said already that pretending is a sort of species, a subspecies of imagination. It's a very striking one because it goes along always with awareness and deliberateness. I think there are many cases of imagination where that's not true. And indeed, I think that just basic word learning is, in a sense, imaginative, because when you learn the word. When you learn the word dog, it doesn't just mean the actual dogs that you personally have come in contact with.
But now you're using the word imaginative in a broader sense.
Very, very broad.
then everything's imaginative. Then you wouldn't want to deny imagination
But
to
that's
non.
important, don't you think?
Exactly. I think it's the basis of mind.
But Alan can't have it both ways. He said.
Oh yes, I can.
Well, okay. Let me
Scots do that.
Oh, we're not going to get into the Scots. Not today, not yet. Because you said before, maybe only humans have imagination in your interesting sense. Maybe only after
no, I said only humans, I think, have pretense in the full-blooded sense.
Okay.
But which is a subspecies, a special subspecies of imagination. But I think anything that has a mind has imagination.
Well, I guess in that
including my cat.
I guess in that sense,
Sure.
it becomes definitional. If you want to do imagination, including powers of generalization, then cockroaches have imagination.
No.
But I think we lose
that's
something.
cognitive generalization. I mean, that's non-conscious. Nobody needs to be aware of generalizing.
So you want to associate imagination with awareness.
Well, this was one of the things we were discussing, wasn't it? That consciousness or awareness being a prerequisite for imagination, or not?
Right. I lost what I was just
I'm not. I
thinking.
mean, in some way, there's all. I actually don't. Definitional arguments per se are not useful. If you want to find imagination to include all sorts of general powers, that's fine. But there's a narrow notion of imagination, the ability to think of the world and know it's not that way. There's broader notions, there's still broader notions, and once we agree on what we're talking about, then we might disagree in an interesting way about the past.
Weren't literacy and mimesis two major events in the evolution of imagination? Mimesis, early cavemen's, and then the advent of literacy. Weren't those two major acts of imagination that differentiate?
Literacy as written language.
Well, you just talked about words and the ability to cognate, to communicate through words and to use language.
Well, see, and that's actually what I was thinking. I don't think, let's say certainly animals communicate, but I don't consider animal communication, no matter how sophisticated you want to think it is, I don't consider it language, because I consider language to be based on imagination.
So why don't animals? I mean, animals generalize.
Absolutely. Animals are probably smarter than we are. I mean, but whatever. They can read each other. They read each other's intentions. They know what's going on. But it's all in the here and now. It's like, I see this, I'm going here, blah, blah, blah. They don't stop and say, gosh, why don't we name this so we could talk about it? That's not the point. The point is, what is this? Is it dangerous? No, let's keep going. But it's not like, gosh, want to have a conversation about this? So this is something that lots of people argue. Animals are enormously communicative, and there's more and more research suggesting that bird calls, it means go this way, go that way, take one of these, whatever. Very quite articulated communication, but it's all in the here and now. It's about, let's keep going. You take a left, I'll take a right, whatever. It's not about ideas. I think ideas are fundamentally human and fundamentally products of imagination. I mean, an idea is like, let's stop, let's not act, and let's just think of something.
So it's frontal cortex sort of stuff.
Yeah.
See, I could talk about the brain.
Can I just pick up on a point of disagreement I sense between Paul and Alan? So just to pin it down a little bit more. It seems to me you were both agreed that children with autism are limited in their pretending. But then we went on briefly to talk about the ability to use a word and to generalize across an infinite number of exemplars. So far as I know, but maybe I'm wrong, children with autism, despite their limitations to pretend play, don't have problems with that particular function of language. Is that?
They sometimes show odd patterns of generalization, but they don't.
They pick out the wrong referent from time to time. But having identified the referent, I don't get the impression they're stuck with that particular referent or a very restricted set of referents.
And of course, it'd be strange if they would, because all sorts of creatures can generalize. Generalization is a natural default.
Basis of cognition.
It's far more intellectually impressive to zoom in and pick out an individual. I mean, in fact, philosophers tend to get it backwards. They think generalization is impressive. But cockroaches generalize. And the immune system generalizes to classes of antigens. What might be, it's incredibly powerful is, I pick out you with a name. Not somebody who looks just like you. I still pick you out if you change your clothes, you put on a hat. That's extraordinarily powerful. And it would be really quirky if autistic kids kind of zoomed in on individuals instead of kinds. But they generalize like everyone else does.
Yeah, but it's adaptive facilitation, isn't it? I mean, you should be able to generalize what is of, otherwise you are spending valuable neural resources attending to every bit of local detail where you could generalize and treat it as a category. And very often that's a problem with autism, that they are attending way too much to the trees and not the wood at all.
It's true that when they draw, my sense, I would think back to one of the first cases that was analysed, which was a girl called Nadia in the United Kingdom, who drew very detailed pictures of horses and occasionally particular people. And what was puzzling about Nadia was that a little bit later she was getting various forms of therapy. It's not clear whether they had any beneficial effect, but in due course her language did improve, and at the same time as her language improved, the specialness of her drawing disappeared. So she drew a much more generic kind of man and a less specific horse. So anyway, I'm going backwards and forwards about the extent to which there is a restriction in autism, or there is a capacity to generalize.
I mean, I think one of the things we have to bear in mind when we're talking about autistic kids is there's a huge range of variation. I mean, there's a much bigger range of variation, particularly nowadays when we use this notion of autistic spectrum disorder, which is deliberately broad.
Everybody has a little of it.
It's deliberately broad, and it's given rise to this huge increase in incidence over the last 20 years. But one of the dimensions of variation in autistic kids is in their intellectual abilities, just the very general abilities, and there's a very large proportion of these kids in fact remain mute throughout their lives, or they have very little or no verbal communication. So those children, of course, are very little studied by the likes of us, because we rely so heavily upon verbal tasks to test and study these kids. So they're the sort of forgotten autistic kids. We have this very substantial degree of mental retardation. Well, but you also have individuals on the spectrum who have above average IQ. They don't have any mental retardation. Some of them have perfectly good language skills. So we shouldn't sort of fall into the trap of talking about them, or this is what they're like, because there's a huge variation there. But still, to return to your point, it's nevertheless interesting that a lot of these basic cognitive and social functions remain in autism, including their social sensitivities, which I think were mentioned a couple of minutes ago. So it seems to me that the word you want to use in connection with autism is complex. It's that word complex. It's a very complex disorder at every level: genetic, neuro, cognitive, behavioural. It's very complex, and there's a huge amount of variation. Probably more variation than exists in the normal. In the normal case.
Do you consider Asperger's as part of that culture?
Yeah, they're generally considered to be on the spectrum. All of these things are decisions that are made literally by a panel of psychiatrists every so often. So they're not really based on natural facts that we truly understand. They are stopgap decisions that are made by a panel. Exactly what the diagnostic categories might be, which number you get, and those labels are based on various kinds of behavioural things. Ultimately, these things will be based, I believe, on things like genetic analysis, neural analysis, and so forth. Objective measures, as might exist with a physical disease, but at the moment we're a long way from that.
But Paul mentioned the Tanner's idea of classifying this condition. But if you have some that are mute and some that are seriously retarded, and some who are functioning
Who are
at
not.
a higher level,
Right.
it may be you're dealing with very different conditions altogether.
Yeah. I mean, so the reason for thinking that there might be some kind of golden thread that runs through the whole gamut, and that's just a hypothesis. One has to be careful that it doesn't transform into one of those
Truth,
a
capital
dogma. But the idea is that where you and this really comes out of this study by Lorna Wing in 1979, who looked at this very large cohort in the UK of kids who were at risk and separated them into groups that showed autism or didn't. And what differentiated the two groups was always that the kids that were placed in the autistic group showed a much more severe impairment in the social domain than a child with whom they were individually matched in terms of general intellectual, verbal abilities. So you can take...
But some retarded children would fall into this first group.
Some retarded... Exactly, and the difference, if you say, well, what's the difference between an autistic retarded individual and a non-autistic retarded individual? The answer basically is social impairment, communicative impairment, and impairment in pretend play. Those are the three pathognomonic, the distinctive signs that separate autism
to
from
throw in
non-autism.
sort of another angle here, I think that autistic, I mean, I don't know this from any literature, but I'm assuming that attachment relations with autistic children, let's say with their parents, are not a problem. I mean, they're perfectly lovable kids.
Right. So one of the interesting
so there's
things is
some social connection.
Absolutely.
I mean, if we're just doing social, I'm right here with you, Mom.
Yeah, that's a very
if you
good,
want me to start sharing a world with you, I don't know if I can go there, but you and me, we're okay. I mean,
it's
would you agree with that from what you've seen, or you?
Yes and no, because I mean, definitely if the social part. I mean, I've got an autistic cousin, so from my personal experience and from my experience of the various people I've tested over the years, I definitely think that yes, they do respond to their caregivers very well, and you can have a perfectly social relationship in the way that you are defining it. However, if we are to look at the figures from genetic studies, ideally twin studies, and the classic bread and butter of any to establish the genetic nature of any condition, you would do twin studies and dizygotic and monozygotic, and also see family trees, we do see that it runs in families. And if autism or autism spectrum conditions is definitely one of the hallmarks of the phenotype is a lack of social abilities. If that is running in the family, then you might expect that even the social environment that the child is exposed to is not really
testing them really as much as another environment.
Yeah, so the gene and environment is very closely interlinked there. So you can't really measure out how much of the social environment that the child gets is affecting his behavior versus how much is the pure genetic effect.
Well, you could compare them with siblings, though.
Sorry?
You could look at non-autistic siblings.
Yes.
as a way to factor out the familial effect.
Yes. But you can't quite sparse out, I mean, very often, I mean, the genetic studies have not been able to sparse out the particular mutation that is there in a single case. Now, of course, there is this huge interest in copy number variation, so which means that it's not really one gene or one polymorphism that's there in one twin versus not another. It's due to the fact that when the DNA is being passed on from one generation to another, certain genes or certain bits of the DNA just get duplicated more times than other bits of the DNA. So you might have the same sequence as your brother of DNA, but you might have more copies of that gene. So you're expressing more of that protein. So that's just a recent thing that has come up in the last couple of years.
Can I ask this question sort of from a different direction, which is we're talking about dissociations issue you raised between empathy and theory of mind, social cognition, which is what Alan has worked on. And psychopathy is often brought up as a dissociation in another way, where psychopaths are considered to have a lack of empathy, caring for other people, yet arguably have no impairment in imagination, pretense, and theory of mind. And I guess I'm curious whether other people here agree with this description, and if so, what does it say that these two things are really separable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good point that Margaret raised, that autistic kids, despite it being the case that the distinctive signs of autism are social impairment, that shouldn't be understood as saying that autistic children lack all social sensitivities or intelligence. That's absolutely not the case, and we've been aware of that all along, which is really one of the main motivations for our work, was to account for those aspects of social sensitivity that are impaired in autism, while allowing that that there are other areas, including, for example, autistic kids become attached to their parents and they show normal things like stranger fear and so forth. And now more recent studies, including some of my own, suggest that when it comes to, for example, judgments about moral good and bad, that autistic kids retain some basic ability there as well, and that basic ability is usually associated with empathizing. So you empathize with the victim, and so it suggests to me, I mean, that this is not always a popular line, but it suggests to me that a lot of these abilities, quite basic abilities, for our brain have, at a basic level, they have a modular design, that there are components that are to a large extent independent of one another, and that those independent components kind of together form a foundation on which the rest of the mind builds.
But from a naive point of view, we're inclined to say that children with autism have difficulty in putting themselves in the place of somebody else, particularly as indicated by the classic false belief task. But now we're underlining the fact that with respect to concern for others, they seem to have some capacity to put themselves in the shoes of other people.
Yeah.
Do you want to spell that out a bit more?
Yeah, well, it's there are, and again I return to this idea that as soon as one starts to talk about autism, the word complex turns up, and one usually finds a pattern of findings that's very hard to understand. So one of the things that autistic children can do is to draw the distinction between somebody transgressing by breaking some kind of conventional rule, such as if I turned up today wearing pajamas. That would transgress a sort of social convention, but it wouldn't involve a victim. I'm sure you know the audience here wouldn't. Yes, you would put up with it without too much distress.
We'd put it to a vote.
You put it to a vote. But to put this kind of in the childish form, you know, if Mary pulls Johnny's hair, then we have a moral transgression and a victim. So Johnny's crying. And normally developing children start making the distinction between those two things about 3 years of age. Well, we've also found that autistic kids will also make the distinction. I pushed this one step further and said, well, is it just maybe that the autistic kids are sort of reacting in a kind of knee-jerk kind of way to the fact that say Johnny might be crying or so forth after getting his hair pulled. So we tested them with a story in which there's a crybaby. So this is, let's say, James and Mary. So Mary has a cookie and James has a cookie. So they both have their own cookies, but Johnny says to Mary, I want your cookie too, give me your cookie too. And Mary says, no, I'm going to eat my cookie all by myself, and James starts to cry. So Mary's done something that's made Johnny cry, so he's showing these distress cues. But of course, we wouldn't say that Mary's done something bad because Johnny's a crybaby. And so it turns out that preschool children agree with us. In fact, they tend to think that Mary did something that was actually slightly good in not giving him. Right. I see people are getting going, oh, yeah, that's quite right. So normally developing kids feel the same way. They're on Mary's side, and so are autistic kids. So these are the kind of puzzles that they throw up. I mean, that's a sort of empathy. It's a sophisticated kind of empathy.
I mean, I think that's actually a great study. I would draw a distinction, which I think feeds nicely into your study, which is there's different forms of empathy and concern. There's what you call imaginative concern. That could be, I can infer that you must feel insulted by what somebody said, and I feel bad for you. And that inference could be very complicated, such that even a normal 5-year-old can't do it, but an adult could, because it involves all sorts of social norms, putting themselves in your shoes, knowing you, and so on. And that you'd expect, as you ramp it up, would be harder for autistic kids than for normally developing kids. But then there's the gut level concern, which we often see in babies and young children, which is, if I see you scream, it's going to affect me. And we know this. We know even babies.
Well, we know animals.
We know babies. So. We know chimps. We know even rats are affected by the screams of other rats. There's some very low level things, neurological level, connecting, I think, to your work. And you should speak about this, but on sort of low level emotional contagion that doesn't require. So some empathy requires a little theory of mind, some a lot theory of mind, and some I bet requires no theory of mind at all.
This actually taps on exactly to my work because the starting idea for my research was really this fractionation of empathy. So one fraction being called cognitive empathy and one called emotional empathy. Now, these names were really the kind of common minimum denominators that I got across the literature, but these were first proposed by a lady called Edith Stein in 1919 in her doctoral thesis. She was a philosopher who trained under Husserl. And this fractionation really captures this cognitive branch or cognitive fraction of empathy is the one that is more akin to the theory of mind or more deliberate, conscious, within quotes, processes that we link with understanding other person's mental states, beliefs. It definitely, false belief task is very much cognitive empathy driven because there is no facial expression to mimic and understand. Whereas the emotional empathy really is much more possibly, I mean, if we go by fashions, it's possibly driven by mirror neurons. And you look at a particular facial expression, there are some neurons in the brain that help you mimic it covertly, not overtly, and hence give you the understanding what's the emotion that person is experiencing. And that's a much more gut level feeling. So these are the two things. Yeah. However, Stein was extremely clear in writing that there's this third kind, which she calls sympathy. And that is where you have, and this has since been written by Franz de Waal and Stephanie Preston as well, is that when I see, if you're walking on the street and you just fall down, my immediate reaction would not be to fall down myself. So automatic contagion doesn't necessarily mean just copying. So it possibly involves, I mean, my automatic response would be to give my hand. So this is this very species I think this is very restricted to primates. I mean, I don't think non-primates show this kind of a helping behavior. This is a function of the, I mean, I guess increased neocortical size or something. That the larger the social group, the more the instances of social behavior like this.
And it's the point raised by Aristotle, which is just because your pain hurts me, I could blame you, I could hate you, I could run away from you. The additional layer is something which is interesting.
What do you do with sociopaths? And we talk about autistic people. You have Jeffrey Dahmer, where you're not autistic.
Right. Now, that actually, so are sociopaths, I should really get definitions clear. Are sociopaths same as what we call psychopaths in UK?
I think so, pretty much, yeah.
Okay, right. So psychopathy and autism, this is an idea that we have written about and James Blair has also written about, though no one actually has tested the two groups together so far as I know. And it really brings in the dissociation between empathy. I mean, we are, as psychologists, we love double dissociations. And I mean, if we can show that cognitive empathy is impaired in autism, so they fail false belief tests, and emotional empathy is impaired in psychopathy, hence they would pretend easily that they know you and they'll kill you without a second thought.
They're two-time losers.
Sorry?
They're two-time losers.
Absolutely. But I mean, this is an interesting hypothesis which I'm definitely very keen to test out myself, but we haven't done it so far.
My experience clinically with psychopaths is that they don't like empathy. They only don't apply their empathy when they want to do something which is to their benefit. But they're perfectly capable of having a loving relationship with their children, empathy towards their children, taking care of their children. But when it comes to a need, when it comes to a situation where their gain is involved,
right,
then they are perfectly happy to suspend any sense of empathy whatsoever.
But is this taking care done in a more rule-based fashion, in the sense that because...
No, not at all. Not at all. And in the relationship, in the therapy, I've had psychopathic patients who are very empathic towards me. But and I don't lack empathy towards them. The only time I begin to lack empathy towards them when I see that in a situation of some kind of disagreement or conflict, whether it's divorce, whether it's business disagreement and so on, they have absolutely not the slightest sense that they're doing anything wrong, and that they're hurting the other person, even though the other person is right.
Could I ask whether, in your opinion, whether the psychopath who expresses empathy for you or for his or her child, do you think that's genuine, or is it, or is that a manipulative gambit?
Well, it comes across just as genuine as the one from the non-psychopath, so that's all I can say.
Right.
How can you decide in that kind of a situation whether
well, it feels the same, right?
Yeah.
Right. No, it's not giving lip service. No, it's not at all giving lip service.
I mean, in a sense, one of the things one would be inclined to think about the psychopath is that they're actually rather good when it comes to theory of mind skills, because in a sense one of their big pleasures is manipulating other minds, and often they're terribly good at that, and you know, it qualifies them for being successful politicians and so forth. So one wonders whether, in fact, I mean, it's a good question how you would actually test that.
Because my sense is, and again, I haven't done any research on this, but I think sometimes when people talk about psychopaths not having empathy, is that they're assuming by virtue of what they do, they shouldn't have empathy.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
I mean, so the dissociation isn't that clean that we would love it to be.
James Blair, who did these extremely interesting studies and kind of started off our interest in these kinds of things, he went into a institution in the UK called Broadmoor, which is Her Majesty's Prison for the Criminally Insane. I think that's the subtitle of the place. So this place contains people who either through psychosis or through some kind of severe psychopathy find themselves and have broken the law, find themselves not guilty by reason of insanity, and then are placed in Broadmoor at Her Majesty's pleasure, which is the phrase that's used. So he found these two groups of psychopaths. Ones that had merely murdered others in a callous way, say in commission of robbing a bank, and a couple of policemen or something got in the way, so they killed them. Versus another group who actually took pleasure in killing and torturing and so forth. The really, the guys that we regard with horror. And he gave these standard tests that are used with preschool kids, and he made them into an adult fashion, between this conventional transgression and a moral transgression. And what he found for the really bad guys, this group that seemed to take pleasure in killing and inflicting pain, they made errors on these tasks, but in a sort of interesting way, which was they would make the same judgments about conventional transgressions as they made about moral. So they considered it a moral transgression to wear pajamas on occasion like this, which suggested that in fact they didn't really appreciate the distinction in the first place, and were simply trying to be manipulative as well. Look what a decent person I actually am. I actually consider it to be morally wrong to, chew gum in class or something of this sort.
So related to that, the one dramatic case of lack of empathy I've seen was when I worked early in my career briefly at Rikers Island. Mm-hmm. But the person I saw was psychotic. He had killed a woman because he said he'd never seen a woman's vagina, and he wanted to see a woman's vagina. Mm-hmm. And so to him it was reasonable that therefore, since they were not going to voluntarily show it to him, he would kill one and have a look at it. After doing that, then he went into a state of panic and then was arrested and brought to Rikers Island. But that's the one case I've seen. So it's hard to imagine, I don't know anything about autism, but it's hard to imagine in other situations a total lack of empathy without psychosis. That kind of severe impairment.
So you mean the serial killers are all are in your view, psychotics?
Do we have some more thoughts from the audience?
Yeah, it's maybe a time for the audience to get involved. Maybe bring up the other podiums. People can come up to one of the mics if they want to talk. That way people downstairs can hear it. Sorry.
Excellent.
Thank you guys again. Part of why I came today.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry. I'm David Hecht. I'm a cognitive science student. And part of why I came was the luminous nature of the panel today, aside from my normal attendance. One thing I think was just touched on was, especially with regard to autism research, but comes up in all of these questions, especially in shared intentionality questions, is the role of the body in these processes, and specifically I'm thinking in terms of sensory feedback, body maps, the use of bodily mimesis, which we didn't quite touch on, but I've seen some research around on. And I just wondered if any of you would like to comment on the role that might play in future-directed imagination and pretend play, and the distinctions between, if there's any research that you know that shows the role of the body in these processes.
We're bodiless, apparently.
Well, I mean, there was some discussion of emotional contagion, and one of the interesting developmental differences, which I've seen informally, because I have 2 sons, is that when you're young, the contagion goes all over. So you're watching a kung fu. You can't watch a kung fu movie without jumping up and kicking things. You can't watch somebody cry without crying yourself. Laughter makes you laugh. And I think I think the emotional contagion literature is very, for adults too, there's a lot of evidence we do this too, but I think we suppress it. We can suppress it quite successfully with I think actually a therapist being the ultimate example of skilled suppression of facial feedback and emotional contagion, where you can keep the same face regardless of what the person is doing. But that's a very difficult skill and happens slowly developmentally.
There's a very nice paper that's just coming out in Behavioral and Brain Sciences by Susan Hurley, where she was the philosopher who proposed this 5-layered model, which kind of maps somewhat developmentally how these different layers of the first emotional contagion, how you suppress it with different cognitive mechanisms. And of course there's the theory of body work, which is Alan's contribution. I'm sure he'll talk about it.
In that work, I generally mean, body in a very general sense of, to contrast with the social world, so the world of physical bodies, which, would include tables and so forth. So.
But it's perhaps worth mentioning there's a huge amount of interest and research at the moment in the question of imitation, and the extent to which imitation is something that is common across the great apes and human beings, or whether human beings show certain hyper-imitative abilities. And one tentative hypothesis, but I'm glad to be corrected and refined if I'm getting this wrong, is that in the case of the great apes, they will often copy what another member of their group does, but the analysis that seems to work so far is that they see that a certain result can be produced. So, for example, they see one of their group pick up a stone and smash it down on a nut, break open the nut and eat the nuts. So, by virtue of watching that member of their group, they see that a certain consequence can be brought about, and they then start playing around with bricks or stones, rocks, and they eventually achieve the same result. But something that's, and again, I'm open to correction on this, something that seems to be more peculiar to human children is a very careful copying of what somebody is doing, even when the person is not necessarily doing it in the most efficient or rational fashion. It's as if the child is saying to itself, well, I'm not sure what they're up to here, but I better do it just as they're doing, because then I'll achieve the appropriate result.
There's a lovely paper coming out. This is very supportive of what you said, by Derek Lyons and Laurie Santos in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, that finds that finding you're describing in like 100 different ways. They have these things like, they have a box and it has a clear lever. And Al says, let me show you how to open this box. And slides the lever out, taps the box twice, goes like this, opens the box, takes it out. Kids will imitate it.
Yeah.
They'll do everything. You press them not to, they will. And they have this lovely design where the person runs out of the room and then someone else shouts to the kid, hey, get the thing as quick as possible. And the kid goes, okay, do it. And so it's not task demands. And they have other studies with capuchins finding, in a sense, capuchins are more rational. They just say, oh, I'll move that out. And that, so you're right, humans are strongly imitative in a way that other primates don't seem to be.
Yeah. I think there's a lovely study a number of years ago by the Hungarian team, Gyuri Gergely, with 15-month-old babies, that which I think shows an astonishing understanding of body, which is that if the experimenter demonstrates turning on a light by banging the light with her head, banging the switch with her head, if the experimenter has her hands free while she does that, then the children imitate what she did. In other words, given the chance, they will operate the switch by banging it with their head. But if the experimenter is wearing a straitjacket, so there's some sort of explanation of why she can't use her arms, and bangs it with her head, then these children that have seen that will imitate simply by pressing the switch with their hands. At 15 months.
15 months?
15 months, yeah. So, that's a sort of extraordinary example of understanding something quite deep about the body. Yeah.
Please. Hi. Hi. I had an interesting experience. With these. Say your name with me. It's John Walter, and my background to a lot of this is with a mirror, but I did some studies, and I was looking up the classic mirror test for self-awareness. Is where they put a dot on the animal's forehead when they're anesthetized, and then those animals that rub their dot when they look in a mirror, they figure, well, they're self-aware. That's their test. And very few animals pass. I think there's only about 4 or so. And so I asked one of the researchers, 4 species, right? Yeah. And I asked one of the researchers, and I said, because I wanted to see, well, let's try this with the mirror test, see if the true mirror, see if that makes any difference. And I asked him, I said, because, I think there might be, because they're more expressive in the true mirror, based on what my ideas were. So then I asked him, I said, well, if you look at the chimp and stuff, they can say he's self-aware because he rubbed the dot, but do you ever see him actually, introspective? Actually looking in his eyes the way we do? So, that was, and he said no. And it was kind of a new idea to him. And that is very uniquely human, to actually look in our own eyes, and as a distinguishing characteristic of who we are and what we think about versus any other animal, any other species, including these 4 that pass that test. So any just thoughts on that?
I think you silenced us with this. Not Alan, apparently.
Well, so the thing that I could add to that is that autistic children readily pass that mirror test. So they do have a sense of self.
But it is also true, there's been a lot of discussion of autistic children's sensitivity to mutual gaze, right?
Yeah, that seems to be a different.
And actually, as a matter of fact, he took the mirrors and tested it with autistic children, and he said that they passed the test less. That they recognize themselves less in the
rouge
true
test,
mirror. I'm not sure whether it was a test or whether they just didn't respond to themselves as much as in a regular mirror. And he took the assumption from that they had less of a sense of self than we do.
There's also a lot of debate of what this test shows. It's quite interesting, but just as in with words like imagination and consciousness, words like self are horribly ambiguous. So what you need to pass the test is a mental model of your body, an appreciation of how mirrors work, and a desire to see, some knowledge of how you should look. And that may be a very different sense of self than when we talk about sense of self regarding consciousness and theory of mind and so on. For instance, you could very easily build a machine that could pass the rouge test, even though the machine would have no sense of self in any interesting regard. So it's hard to work it all out. And I actually issues of looking into your eyes for introspective interest. It's over my head, but that sounds actually more closely related to what we're really interested in when we're talking about self.
Right, and it was like a distinguishing between that animals do this, this, and this, and this, but this is one thing they don't seem to do.
Yeah.
One of the things I suppose that I might do if I was to stare into somebody's eyes is that I'd be trying to see into their soul through their eyes. Well, I can see into my own soul without looking in my eyes. So I have that sort of advantage in the case of self.
In your eye.
Come on up.
Okay.
Just say who you are.
It's more
Could
common.
you say who you are?
Okay. I'm a conceptual artist, and I actually want to hear more about what it was advertised in the flyer. But when I listen to the discussion, I have a different comment. First of all, I would like to say that it's. I'm not from any movement then defending rights of animals, but I would like to talk about that because from my point of view, there wouldn't any kind of learning is impossible without at least basic imagination and pretending. If there is no imagination in animal's mind, they would not. Lions never would learn from behavior of their mothers how they could hunt, or birds would never reach south, or other animals.
You think that requires imagination?
Absolutely. If you, when lions see their mothers, how they hunt, they pretend in their mind that they also could do the same thing, and they start to learn it. And also, alpha male would never fight for the first place in the, I don't know how it calls,
Hierarchy.
in hierarchy, because he would be afraid, he would be live only in the same moment, because it's dangerous to fight with alpha male. So he would never pretend in his mind to be an other alpha male, and there is all other different examples. And also about empathy. It's from my personal experience. When I was in Russia, once I was in small village, and I saw many crows, you know, the birds. And they I don't know, cried and did something. There was a lot of them, and I didn't understand what's going on. And then I saw a small crow on ground with a broken leg, and they tried to lead him and to the place and try to frighten all other, I don't know who, for example, humans don't touch it. So there is possible empathy even in this species, you see. And from my point of view, every human behavior have basic features in animals.
Absolutely. I think we do agree on the fact that we have I mean, most of the neural mechanisms have evolved from the basic hardware that's already there in lower species.
Yeah.
So, but as far and I think different instances of social behavior have been anecdotally reported in birds, and even, I mean, the big problem for social behavior when we mention it like that is when people start talking about bees, because we are talking a very high level of social organization without instances of the stuff that you've just mentioned, this example of crows growing around. So that's a very organized society, but not many instances of caring for injured bees is known about. I mean, I haven't read or heard about that. So social structure is one thing, and social behavior is another thing. So whether the crow, the instance that you mentioned, whether it's a function of social structure, saying that, okay, the baby crow maybe must be removed, and that's why it's doing part of as if executing a social rule versus something that's spurred by a sense of empathy. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. So that's the you really have to kind of take your choice on that.
You put your money on animals. If it was a choice between animals or computers, you put your money on animals.
Yes.
Oh, totally. Raise your hand, animals over computers.
Okay, thank you.
We have another question coming up.
Yeah, my name is Mordecai Newman. I'm an attorney. In a prior phase of my life, I attended Yale Drama School with Frank Levy. You mentioned the development of the capacity for pretend play in children. There's a counter phenomenon that I wonder if you have any insight into, which is the loss of the capacity among many people as they get older to distinguish between pretense and actual reality. I'll give you a concrete example that comes to mind is the attack on the Harry Potter novels in some fundamentalist religious circles on the ground that this is actually a threat to their own belief system, which represents a failure to acknowledge pretense in a number of ways. First of all, it represents a failure to acknowledge that the Harry Potter novels are themselves pretend. They're not an actual assertion of a counter system. It represents a failure, perhaps, to acknowledge that the system in which they believe, to which they attach allegiance, is itself perhaps the result of some kind of imaginative process rather than a literal response to the here and now. Do you have any insight into this sort of counter?
Well, there's a different. I would actually give a slightly different interpretation on it, but then I will turn around and agree with you. I think a lot of the objection to these things is fully aware that it's fictional. So I'll switch the example a bit. If there was a violently anti-Semitic TV show, I might say, hey, I wish that wasn't on. And you could say, hey, don't you understand it's just a story? I would respond, I know it's just a story. I'm fully aware of that, but I dislike the message this story conveys. Why would it make a difference? Well, that's where you get into an interesting fact, which is the human mind is to a large extent porous between fiction and reality. Things we learn in fiction get incorporated into reality, including moral facts. And there's a lot of psychological data now. For instance, there's one study, and this actually fits your point about age, because they did this with older adults. They gave them a series of facts, medical facts, and some of them they said, this one is true, this one is false, this one is true, this one is false. What happens a week later when tested, they had remembered them all as true. Because it's very difficult to parcel them out. So in some way, I think even if people can initially tell fiction from reality apart, the fiction will permeate in their minds, and that's a reason why fiction makes a difference, good and bad.
I would distinguish, though, between an anti-Semitic fiction and something like the Harry Potter novels. If something is anti-Semitic, that suggests kind of polemical purpose underneath. And it's the polemical purpose that you're objecting to. In other words, you're making a point about Jews or the Jewish religion. To see a polemical purpose with regard to religion in the Harry Potter novels, it seems to me, is again to confuse imagination and reality.
But in some way, I think you're underestimating J.K. Rowling. So in some way, like my sympathies are with you. I love the Harry Potter, the movies at least. Books too long. But in some way, Rowling does want to convey moral and social messages, including a famous one after the fact where he said, hey, Dumbledore was gay. Get my message here? And in some way, I think that's a nice message. But if she said, hey, Dumbledore was Republican, I'd say, oh no, the wonderful Dumbledore is Republican. And so there are messages.
But don't you think that the attack on the Potter novels was initially not something like that? It was, this is proposing wizardry as an alternate system. The idea that wizards can have a system is a threat to my raising my children to believe in whatever.
But I think there's a difference between not being able to pretend and purposely trying not to pretend or getting some other plan or need or whatever fulfilled. And I think the people you're talking about, they're purposely acting as if they don't want to pretend in order to make this point that they have. I'm sure that each of them is perfectly happy to pretend in other situations.
Let me just make one other quick point, then I'll sit down and listen. The other thing I mentioned was, and I don't want to come across as anti-religious across the board, but I think it's whatever religion one might ascribe to, you have to then reject a whole other set of religious assumptions that other people hold. So whether you're religious or not religious, you have to assume that a lot of people are religious based on their own fantasies, and that people have incorporated what is essentially a product of the imagination, a counterfactual situation, and attached to that as reality.
Could
you address yourself to that?
So I think you're putting your finger on a very important psychological point about the imagination. One that psychologists have largely ignored, I think. We tend to think of the imagination and the ability to represent possibilities as allowing us to think about the not real. But it seems to me we use it a great deal, and children use it a great deal, in order to construct a picture of reality. So, for example, when children learn about the history of their community or their nation, all the events that they're told about, whether it's the Civil War or the War of Independence or Julius Caesar or whatever, are events that they obviously can't witness firsthand. They have to construct those in their imagination. But the interesting thing about history is that we are instructed or led to take it to be true. So I think we have a tremendous facility for that, and I think it's extremely important. That doesn't prevent us, as you're pointing out, from sometimes taking for true things which perhaps we ought to be a bit more skeptical about. But in some sense, I have sympathy with these fundamentalist objections, because they're exemplifying the very point that I think psychologists have neglected, namely this capacity to take for true that which you can only imagine, which is, I would say, uniquely human.
Could autistic children, or could autistic children who became adult be religious?
That's a very good question. I actually haven't thought about that before.
It's not something they manifest in any florid way.
Jesse Bering has a nice review article in an obscure journal where he reviews all of the evidence bearing either way on this, and it's a very short article. But the claim is interesting, which is a lot of people with autism, the higher functioning sort, love religion. They love the rituals. The Judaism, they're crazy about the preparing things and so on. But, and again, this is very high functioning because these are the people who can talk about it. They don't seem to believe in supernatural beings.
Yes, it's a more of a systemizing view of the religion. So it's a complex system with definite rules.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to make a comment on the previous point that was raised from the floor. Seems to me that kind of example in general is not so much a fudging of imagination and reality as a fudging or a collapsing between religion and politics. And it seems to me that what's distinctive about fundamentalism is really a political movement, whether it's based in American Protestantism or in Middle Eastern Islam. But these are really political movements that co-opt religion, and of course there are many other kinds of examples in history.
But some people will say that it's a religious movement that co-opts politics. I mean, I think there's a lot of debate to be had on that particular issue.
I'm Ben Roth. I'm a psychoanalyst and group therapist, and I write frequently on film. I was struck in the film by the name of the character, which is Chance. And then I was struck by your comment about psychopaths, and having written about psychopaths in the movies. There's a distinction made by Michael Douglas, who started the serial killers unit at the FBI, that there are two kinds of psychopaths, organized and disorganized. And the organized psychopath is capable of planful actions. But the character in the movie doesn't seem to be capable of planful actions. And I wondered if you would comment on that, if imagination isn't another way of establishing a tentative plan, which is not evident in this kind of behavior. And I think Kosinski's choice of the name Chance gives us a key as to what he's really telling us about this character. Things happen to him. Events by chance happen to him. He's hit by the car. He's taken in. The man is dying again. He gets to tell people the same story and say the same words, and they treat him very differently. But in terms of autistic children and the research on imagination, how does planful activity get examined?
I would just repeat the point I made before. I think that's a great question, which is, I do think that planful activity requires imagination, even in the narrowest sense possible. In order to explicitly plan for the future, I have to say, if I were to do this, and I set up a world, and if I think that I've done it, I'd be hopelessly confused. So I have to hold it as a counterfactual. What would become of that? If I were to do that, separate from this, what would become of that? Which option is better? And we do this sort of effortlessly, but if you think about it, it's an extraordinary act. And I think there's probably great differences even among psychopaths, among normally functioning people, into how well you can do that.
I mean, if I could add to that, I mean, you're talking of a very, very conscious phenomenon there, where you think of consequences. But even if you think the very act of, if I just take this glass and bring it to my mouth, my mouth muscles are already preparing or showing signs of activity, preparing for me to take a gulp from this glass. But recently there was this experiment done by Rizzolatti's group, who got facial EMG and magnetoencephalography, which showed that even for such planned actions, people with autism do not show the preparatory muscular activity. So he argues that it's action chains that are not coordinated. So and this is action at a very, very basic level. This is not conscious planned action at all. So that's just, I mean, last year's PNAS paper, and very, very nice study on
Hi, my name is Lauren Coates, and I'm an art student. And I was wondering what you think is the connection between imagination and creativity. And like an artist, I know they use inspiration and passion for their art, but what part imagination plays in that, and if you know anything.
I think Paul should be able to answer this.
Well, there's a sense in which psychologists have banged their head somewhat unsuccessfully against questions about creativity. So
somewhat.
There was a flurry of work, I guess, in the 50s and 60s, trying to look at very creative people, be they architects or scientists, and to try to identify certain distinctive features of their...
Csikszentmihalyi, is that what you're thinking of?
Well, that would be one. McKinnon would be another. There was an English psychologist called Liam Hudson, who was a third. But I don't think it led to any clear-cut conclusions about what distinguished the truly creative architect or the truly creative biochemist from the less creative ones. And if anything, I think psychologists have retreated, and I would applaud them for doing so myself, to, if anything, a somewhat more pedestrian, at least from the point of view of the outside world, a more pedestrian view of when we use our imagination. That was partly why I myself used the phrase "the work of the imagination" in writing my books. I wanted to draw attention to the fact that the imagination is all over the place. It's used in all sorts of domains, including the domain of planning, as Paul has pointed out, including the domain of causal analysis. We often ask ourselves, well, how did this come about? How might it have ended up otherwise if things had been different? And we do that both with respect to, why our particular relationship with someone is going through choppy water, or what the origins of the First World War were. We engage in that kind of counterfactual thinking. So I myself, I'd be interested to hear reactions from other people on the panel. I myself think that that's a good move, because it takes away a bit of the mystery, and it gets us to start thinking about the extraordinary ability of children to think about things that are not here and not now, but merely possible.
But I just want to add something to this. Wouldn't you agree then that anything that is not here and now, and part of what you're doing this minute, requires imagination to be there? I mean, history, you said, planning is imagination. To even think about history, whether it's true or fiction or whatever it is, I mean, it's not here in front of us. I mean, anything that's not here is of the imagination.
Sure, but consider another example. Consider mathematics, which is autistic children can be very good at mathematics. Even babies have sort of very abstract mathematical understanding.
Right.
Yet I think in a deep sense that's not here and now, math. There's no material objects. Numbers are very abstract entities. So in some way, I mean, I would just say that there's different cases. History is interesting because that really does require imagination, even in a narrow sense of creating another world and understanding it.
But you don't think that math is imaginative?
I think if math is imaginative, then it requires a different sort of analysis regarding autism, because it doesn't seem to be the same sort of imaginative showing up in pretend or counterfactual reasoning or fiction. So
it's a very interesting example. I guess my first reaction would be to say that mathematics seems to be special in the sense that, first of all, it's a very highly regulated domain within which you can make various maneuvers. And there's a sense in which when you make those maneuvers, you're neither making real maneuvers nor fictional ones. It seems to be a world that's neither the one nor the other. I mean, I'm not putting that terribly well, but I think you sense what I mean.
No, I'm not being entirely constructive here. I'm more trying to say that it's more modular, more complicated than I don't want to subsume too many things under one thing, because then I worry we just lose any distinctions whatsoever. If everything's imagination and nothing's imagination.
No, but everything is an imagination. Go ahead.
I was thinking more on the mathematics example, but mathematics as a system is, primarily obeys laws of formal logic, and no matter how imaginative your mathematical models are, they have to be governed by the same laws that govern the rest of the system. Whereas when we are talking of pretense and kind of possibly non-parameterized situations, which are like more social situations where you don't have the same rules for everything, possibly we are talking of two different domains altogether. I mean, the social domain with its non-measurable, non-parameterizable variables versus mathematics with its formal rules.
I would agree with that, and I think that sort of, it's not really abstract versus concrete. That's more of a dimension. I just wanted to say quickly that I totally agree with what Paul said about the fact our field has not gotten any progress with explaining genius or creativity. But I think maybe we can do well with some very basic fundamental things. And one thing I would point to, building off the discussion other people had about drawings, is I think art tends to require some sort of social understanding of the self and the other. Often art is representational, often art seeks to evoke emotion in others, evoke certain ideas in others. And perhaps one reason why children with autism draw like machines is because there's nothing communicative, there's nothing expressive about it. It really is like a machine. People have pointed out that the artwork of Nadia is exactly like a street artist who, when copying something, goes to the other side and copy it upside down. Because then, when it's devoid of meaning, you would copy it more accurately. And maybe maybe what this work points to is some sort of social component, maybe a non-obvious social component in these creative enterprises.
I think there's I mean, if you mean creative in the socially honoured sense, how to be a Warhol or Beethoven or so on. Psychologists haven't done well there, and I think they never will, and I think they shouldn't even try. But if you mean creative in a much more mundane sense, such as just what you or I do every moment of the day when we make up sentences that have never been said by anyone before, I think there we've done better. And it's that sort of sense of creativity and imagination that I'm interested in. It's just the things that socially we regard as being perfectly everyday and mundane, and you can't really boast that your child does it because every child does it. But those things are wonderful, they are marvelous, exquisite, and they are creative and imaginative. And typically it seems to me that you shouldn't think that to be creative is in some kind of opposition with rule govern. because actually it's really rules that allow you to be creative in the first place, whether it's speaking a language and creating new sentences in the language, or even being a Warhol, and there the rules of art are much more ineffable than the rules of language, but still Warhol knew perfectly well what those rules were and what he was doing breaking them. And so there's not an opposition. It's really rules that create creativity.
Sorry, can I just pursue that for 1 second more? Then I was wondering whether you can have clearly anarchic visual artists, but can you have anarchic mathematicians?
Well, there's people. I mean, this fits more with Alan's point, but there are people who, of course, broke the rules of geometry, the non-Euclidean geometries. When you took away an axiom to see what happens, and none of it's good. I mean, it's just all these terrible things happen when you parallel lines meet and work on. But of course, you can have anarchy, but I'm not sure you can have anarchy in visual art too. I think what comes off as anarchy is successful to the extent that, as Alan pointed, you're deliberately flaunting the rules. Right. But if my kid scribbles on something not knowing the rules and I bring it to MoMA, they're going to say, who cares? Because he didn't know the rule, he didn't know what to break.
Can we take a last question?
Yes, sure.
My name is Jordan Schachter. I'm a filmmaker. And we talked today about the link between imagination and empathy, and examples in terms of autism and psychopathology of a lack of empathy. But I wonder if there's anything interesting to say about the opposite, people who are extremely empathetic. And I don't know if there's a linkage between imagination and empathy. I was just thinking quickly, example for me is in terms of like dogs and cats and pounds. I never think about it, and I got an email where a specific name of a dog was mentioned, and suddenly I found myself much more empathetic. And I'm just curious about if there are any studies about an excess of empathy or a greater amount of empathy.
Well, look, the phenomena you're talking about is well documented, which is you stick a name, everything you stick a name, empathy shoots up. A picture will swamp you. And I mean, George Gergely, again, the Hungarian group, have speculated about the mirror image of autism, which is people who have their empathy things turned up too high. And he's,
what happens to them?
Well, nobody. I mean, one suggestion is a form of paranoia, which is you're trying to get into everybody's head all the time, and it becomes too much.
I have
in psychoanalysis, it's easy to see cases of excessive empathy, and in some cases of excessive empathy that are pathological.
Because people become depressed, or because.
Yeah. People become depressed, or people become overly emotional in a situation.
Do they disregard themselves when they're overly empathetic?
Well, that doesn't really have much to do with them, but they can't stop themselves from becoming overly emotional in a situation.
It's like Borges' character, Funes the Memorias. Remember that he just remembers everything and he can't remember anything.
I mean, sorry.
Go ahead.
This one particular group of patients who, I mean, I shouldn't call them patients really, people who have the diagnosis of touch vision synesthesia, who are a very interesting group to study in terms of this excessive empathy that you've just mentioned. So this group of people is, if they see somebody else touched, they feel it on their own skin. And when you administer general instruments of empathy, like empathy questionnaires and stuff like that, and also measure them in the scanner, measure their brain activity in the scanner, you find increased activity because whenever they see somebody. So empathy has, I mean, as you would guess, that we are taking a very, very body-centric view of empathy here, and this particular special group might actually represent some form of connection between areas that are not normally connected that strongly, and hence giving us this excessive knowledge of the other person's sensory feeling. So that, but again, I don't know about whether they're good in imagining things or not.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I have a student, Karen Hussar, who's looking at an interesting group of children, roughly between 6 and 11. And these are children growing up in ordinary meat-eating homes, but they have decided that they want to be vegetarians. And when we talk to these children, we find a couple of things which are difficult to put together. On the one hand, if you ask them why they don't eat meat, they talk about the suffering of animals and wanting to avoid that. But then if you quiz them about other people who eat meat, you might have thought, well, they've erected a moral rule about this, you shouldn't cause that kind of suffering. But they're remarkably tolerant toward people, including, of course, people in their own family who do eat meat. So it's an interesting combination of sort of heroism but tolerance. Now, just in relation to this particular question, what we don't yet understand is how they've arrived at that decision. But the thought that keeps going through my mind is that these children have, in some, not, I wouldn't want to in any sense say it's an excess of empathy, but they've enlarged the circle, perhaps more than some of us in this room, and therefore they feel animals' pain more acutely than we do, and they've made a decision on that basis.
I'll ask the Simon Baron Cohen question. Are these children predominantly female?
Two-thirds are female.
I didn't say that. Thank you.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philoctetes events is available at philoctetes.org.